The family disappointment. The Martinez family had perfected the art of legal career dismissal, treating my work as a public defender like an extended period of professional confusion that I'd eventually outgrow once I got serious about making real money with my law degree. At 31, I was still the family's cautionary tale about pursuing idealistic work instead of lucrative legal careers that generated serious income and social prestige. "Jordan's wasting their Harvard law education defending criminals," Dad announced during Sunday dinner at the Capital Grille, the expensive steakhouse my sister Elena had chosen to celebrate her latest partnership offer at the white shoe corporate firm downtown. 3 years out of law school and still working for poverty wages representing drug dealers and thieves instead of real clients who can pay real fees. I cut my filet mignon methodically, the familiar weight of family disappointment settling on my shoulders like a judicial robe made of lead. My work at the federal public defender's office wasn't defending criminals. It was protecting constitutional rights and ensuring equal justice for people who couldn't afford private attorneys. "Jordan needs to face economic reality," Mom added, sipping her wine with the authority of someone who'd built a successful medical practice through practical choices and profitable specialization. "Public defense is noble charity work, but it's not a sustainable career. No partnership track, no equity participation, no wealth-building potential. No wealth-building potential. My salary was federally funded with excellent benefits, job security, and the opportunity to argue cases that shaped constitutional law at the highest levels of the federal court system. Elena just received a partnership offer with a starting equity share," Dad said proudly, gesturing toward my sister who was glowing with the satisfaction of quantifiable professional achievement. "Real corporate clients, real billable hours, real money. That's what law school was supposed to lead to." The contrast was never subtle. While Elena's corporate practice generated impressive fees representing Fortune 500 companies, my public defense work was consistently characterized as misguided idealism that would eventually be abandoned for practical legal employment. "Jordan's problem," Uncle Carlos said with the wisdom of someone who'd built a successful personal injury practice, "is that public defense doesn't teach real lawyering skills. You can't build a serious legal career representing people who can't pay fees. Real lawyering skills. As if constitutional criminal defense and federal appeals work weren't among the most complex and demanding areas of legal practice. The public defender's office exploits young lawyers," Aunt Maria added knowledgeably, "despite having no experience with criminal law. They use idealistic graduates as cheap labor while the real lawyers handle paying clients. It's not sustainable long-term. Not sustainable. Despite federal public defender positions being among the most secure and prestigious appointments in criminal law. What exactly does Jordan do all day in that office?" Cousin Roberto asked with genuine curiosity, as if my work was so foreign it required translation. "Defends people who committed crimes and can't afford real lawyers," Elena explained with the patient tone used for discussing misguided career choices. "Drug cases, theft, assault. Very noble, but not exactly the kind of legal work that builds a serious practice. Very noble but not serious legal work." While I regularly argued before federal appellate courts in the Supreme Court of the United States. "The problem with criminal defense," Uncle Carlos said with authority, "is that you're always representing guilty people who probably deserve whatever punishment they get. Jordan's wasting time and talent defending the indefensible. Defending the indefensible. Because apparently constitutional rights only applied to people who could afford private attorneys. Jordan could make excellent money in corporate law," Mom suggested brightly, as if she'd discovered the perfect solution to my career confusion. "All that criminal procedure knowledge could be valuable for compliance and regulatory work. Real companies would pay well for that expertise. Corporate compliance. Using my constitutional law background to help corporations avoid criminal liability rather than protecting individual rights. Or white-collar criminal defense," Elena added helpfully. "Rich people get arrested too and they pay much better than street criminals. Apply criminal law skills to clients who can actually afford proper representation. White-collar defense. Representing wealthy defendants rather than ensuring constitutional protection for people who couldn't buy justice. The important thing," Dad said with the finality of someone dispensing life wisdom, "is that Jordan eventually transitions into legal work that provides financial security and professional recognition. This public defender phase can't continue indefinitely." Public defender phase. 7 years of rigorous legal training and 3 years of federal criminal practice reduced to a temporary detour from real legal employment. What they didn't know was that my phase had produced constitutional law victories that were transforming criminal justice nationwide. My cases had established precedents protecting Fourth Amendment rights, ensuring adequate legal representation, and preventing prosecutorial misconduct that violated due process. They also didn't know that the Department of Justice had been monitoring my work for the past year, identifying me as one of the most effective federal defenders in the country and considering me for a federal judicial nomination. But in their narrative, I remained the family member who'd wasted my education on unprofitable idealism instead of building a lucrative career like Elena's corporate success. Jordan's supervisor keeps encouraging these appeals and constitutional challenges, Mom said with concern. These public defender managers don't understand that most lawyers need to focus on building paying practices, not fighting unwinnable cases for people who can't afford fees. Unwinnable cases that had resulted in Supreme Court victories and changed federal criminal procedure. Criminal appeals are so time-consuming, Aunt Maria agreed knowledgeably. You spend months on cases that might not even succeed while corporate lawyers are closing deals and generating revenue every day. Time-consuming appeals that had established constitutional precedents protecting millions of Americans' rights. The public sector lifestyle isn't sustainable long-term, Dad concluded with practical authority. Jordan needs to start thinking about private practice, business development, client acquisition. Real legal career building that requires entrepreneurial thinking. Real legal career building that apparently couldn't include protecting constitutional rights and ensuring equal justice under law. The constitutional breakthrough. What my family didn't understand was that my recent casework had achieved what criminal defense attorneys had been pursuing for decades. Supreme Court precedents that fundamentally strengthened constitutional protection against prosecutorial overreach and inadequate legal representation. For 3 years, I'd been handling federal criminal appeals that challenged systemic violations of defendants' constitutional rights. These weren't just individual cases. They were carefully selected challenges to prosecutorial practices that undermined the entire criminal justice system. The breakthrough had come 18 months earlier, during preparation for a case that had become routine since my family's dismissive comments about my work schedule. Jordan stays in that office until all hours, Mom had complained during a recent family dinner. Normal lawyers work regular business hours and go home to build real practices. This obsession with criminal appeals isn't healthy or profitable. Those late hours had led to the discovery that would define my legal career. While researching prosecutorial misconduct patterns across federal districts, I'd identified systematic Brady violations, prosecutors hiding evidence that could exonerate defendants. More importantly, I documented these violations well enough to challenge them at the Supreme Court level, creating the opportunity to establish precedent that would protect all criminal defendants. The case had been extraordinary. United States v. Morrison involved a federal drug prosecution where prosecutors had hidden evidence that the primary witness was a paid government informant with a history of perjury. My client faced life imprisonment based on testimony that prosecutors knew was unreliable. Attorney General Sarah Williams had initially opposed our appeal, but as the evidence of prosecutorial misconduct mounted, the Department of Justice had been forced to acknowledge systemic problems with federal criminal prosecution. Ms. Martinez, she'd said during a pre-argument conference, your research has exposed constitutional violations that we didn't realize were occurring systematically. This case will require us to reform federal prosecution standards. The evidence suggests these violations are widespread, I'd replied, still processing the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. That's exactly why your work is so important, the Attorney General had said. Constitutional protection requires lawyers willing to challenge the system when it fails. The Supreme Court had ruled unanimously in our favor, establishing precedent that required prosecutors to disclose all potentially exonerating evidence and imposing sanctions for Brady violations. The decision had been hailed as the most significant criminal procedure ruling in decades. But the most remarkable recognition came when Attorney General Williams had personally called to discuss my career trajectory and potential federal judicial appointment. Ms. Martinez, she'd said during our first private conversation, your constitutional law work represents exactly the kind of legal thinking that shapes judicial practice. We want to nominate you for federal district court. Federal District Court nomination. The pinnacle of legal career achievement. Lifetime appointment to the federal bench with the opportunity to shape constitutional law for generations. What kind of timeline are we discussing? I'd asked. 18 months to confirmation hearings if you're interested in judicial service. We're prepared to provide full administration support for your nomination. Full administration support. The Attorney General was offering to shepherd my nomination through the Senate confirmation process, with White House backing and federal judicial appointment. But my family remained convinced that my public defense work was misguided idealism that would eventually be abandoned for profitable legal practice like Elena's corporate career. Jordan just needs to accept that the public defender phase is ending, Dad had said during last week's family dinner. Time to transition into real legal work that provides actual income and professional prestige. Actual income. Federal judges received substantial salaries, lifetime tenure, and the highest professional recognition in the legal system. Professional prestige. Federal judicial appointment represented the apex of legal career achievement, with influence extending far beyond any private practice. But none of that mattered in my family's assessment, because public defense wasn't real, legal work like representing corporate clients or handling personal injury cases. The final irony came when I learned that this weekend's Federal Bar Association conference, where Attorney General Williams would be announcing judicial nominations to the national legal community, was being held at the same hotel where my family had planned their monthly celebration dinner. Let's go to the Watergate Hotel, Elena had suggested during our planning call. They have that elegant dining room and the atmosphere is perfect for celebrating my partnership offer. The Watergate Hotel, where the federal legal establishment's most influential figures would be gathered to discuss judicial appointments, including my nomination. Jordan should come celebrate with us, Mom had added. They spend too much time isolated in that public defender office. Family social events would be good for their professional development. Family social events would be good for my professional development, while the Attorney General prepared to announce that I'd been selected for federal judicial nomination. The conference setup. The week before our family celebration dinner, the Federal Bar Association conference had transformed the Watergate Hotel into the epicenter of federal legal discussions. Distinguished federal judges, Department of Justice officials, and federal prosecutors gathered to review the year's most significant legal developments and plan future judicial appointments. Attorney General Williams had specifically requested that I attend the conference's final evening, when judicial nomination announcements would be made to the assembled federal legal community. Jordan, she'd said during our planning call, your nomination represents the kind of constitutional commitment that defines federal judicial service. The legal community needs to understand what you've accomplished. I'm honored to be considered, I'd replied, though I was nervous about the confirmation process ahead. You won't just be considered, Attorney General Williams had smiled. You'll be nominated. Your constitutional law work is exactly why we make these appointments, to ensure federal courts are staffed by lawyers who understand justice. Federal judicial nomination. My family's public defender phase would be recognized as preparation for lifetime appointment to the federal bench. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more uncomfortable. My family's celebration dinner was scheduled for the same evening as my nomination announcement, in the same hotel where federal legal leaders would be discussing my judicial appointment. We should get a nice table in the main dining room, Dad had suggested during our planning. Somewhere prominent where Elena can network with other successful lawyers who might be dining there. The main dining room where federal judges and Justice Department officials would be discussing my constitutional law precedents and judicial nomination. Jordan needs to dress appropriately for once, Mom had added with concern. No more of those rumpled public defender suits. Real social events require professional appearance befitting successful lawyers. Professional appearance for an evening when I'd be recognized as a federal judicial nominee. I'd spent the week trying to decide whether to tell my family about the nomination or let them discover my achievement organically during their celebration of Elena's partnership offer. By Saturday I'd made my decision. For 3 years, they dismissed my public defense work as misguided idealism while lecturing me about real legal careers. They'd characterized my constitutional law practice as unprofitable charity work that prevented me from building a serious practice. They'd made their assumptions about my worth and potential. Now they'd face the reality of what I'd actually accomplished while they weren't paying attention. The revelation. The Watergate Hotel's main dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as distinguished guests discussed legal developments and judicial appointments over elegant dinners. Following the conference's conclusion, federal legal leaders from across the country had gathered to celebrate constitutional achievements and plan collaborative justice initiatives. My family arrived precisely at 7, dressed in their finest attire for Elena's partnership celebration. Dad had specifically requested a prominent table where other diners could appreciate our family's legal success. "This is perfect," Mom said as we were seated near the dining room's center. "So sophisticated, and I can see several other successful-looking lawyers dining here tonight." Successful-looking lawyers that included Supreme Court clerks, federal circuit judges, and Department of Justice senior officials. Elena held court at the table's head, describing her partnership terms and client acquisition strategies while Dad ordered expensive champagne to commemorate her achievements. "To real legal success," Dad announced, raising his glass in the traditional toast. "And to Elena's continued excellence in providing valuable services that generate serious profits and professional recognition." Real legal success. Valuable services that generate serious profits. While constitutional lawyers from around the country gathered to discuss precedents that would protect Americans' rights for generations. "Jordan should really start thinking about transitioning into profitable practice like Elena's career," Mom said, continuing the familiar theme. "All this public defender time isn't leading anywhere economically viable or professionally prestigious. Public defender time that had produced Supreme Court victories and qualified me for federal judicial appointment. I keep telling Jordan that corporate criminal defense would be perfect," Elena added helpfully. "They know all the constitutional procedure. Ideal for representing executives and businesses that pay substantial fees. Corporate criminal defense, while the Department of Justice prepared to nominate me for lifetime federal judicial appointment. The important thing," Dad said, warming to his favorite lecture topic, "is that Jordan eventually accepts that public service careers aren't sustainable. They need private practice with real clients who can afford proper legal fees. Private practice while federal legal leaders prepared to offer me the highest honor in the American legal system." At that moment, Attorney General Sarah Williams approached our table with several distinguished colleagues I recognized from federal court proceedings and constitutional law publications. "Jordan," she said warmly, "wonderful to see you here this evening." My family looked up with polite curiosity, assuming this was a casual social encounter. "Attorney General Williams," I replied, my voice carefully professional. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues," Attorney General Williams continued, her voice carrying the authority that commanded federal courtrooms and Department of Justice policy. Chief Judge Patricia Chin from the D.C. Circuit, Federal Public Defender Director Michael Rodriguez, and Deputy Attorney General David Thompson. D.C. Circuit Chief Judge. Federal Public Defender Director. Deputy Attorney General. Names that represented the pinnacle of federal legal authority. My family's faces showed confusion as they processed these introductions. "We've been discussing your remarkable constitutional law breakthrough," Chief Judge Chin said with genuine enthusiasm. "Your Brady Doctrine precedent could transform federal criminal procedure for decades." Constitutional law breakthrough. Transform federal criminal procedure. Professional recognition at the highest levels of federal legal authority. "I'm sorry," Elena said uncertainly, "but who are you exactly?" "Sarah Williams, Attorney General of the United States," she replied with crisp authority. "I'm here to announce that Jordan has been selected for federal district court nomination, one of the most significant judicial appointments of this administration. Attorney General of the United States. Federal district court nomination. Most significant judicial appointment." The family celebration had transformed into a federal legal announcement. "There seems to be some confusion," Dad said quickly, his voice defensive. "Jordan works as a public defender. They don't have the experience for real judicial positions." "Mr. Martinez," Deputy Attorney General Thompson said with the quiet authority that filled federal courtrooms, "Jordan has established constitutional precedents that protect millions of Americans' rights. Their work represents the kind of legal excellence that qualifies for federal judicial service. Constitutional precedents. Protect millions of Americans' rights. Legal excellence qualifying for federal judicial service. The family's public defender phase," was being recognized as preparation for the highest legal honor. That's impossible, Mom said, her voice rising with confusion. Jordan just represents criminals who can't afford real lawyers. They don't do the kind of legal work that leads to judgeships. Dr. Martinez, Federal Public Defender Director Rodriguez said with institutional authority, Jordan has argued before the Supreme Court and established precedents that strengthen constitutional protection. This represents the kind of advocacy that exemplifies judicial qualification. Supreme Court arguments. Constitutional precedents. Judicial qualification. Jordan's nomination will require Senate confirmation, Attorney General Williams added, her voice carrying the weight of executive authority. We're confident the legal community will support this appointment based on their constitutional law achievements. Senate confirmation. Legal community support. Constitutional law achievements. Elena sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. Her corporate partnership was being overshadowed by constitutional law accomplishments that would influence federal judicial practice for generations. Jordan, Mom said desperately, turning toward me with tears forming, why didn't you tell us about any of this? We had no idea your public defender work was actually important. For 3 years I tried to explain my constitutional law practice while they dismissed it as misguided charity work. I described my federal court victories while they lectured me about finding profitable employment. I tried to tell you, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the dining room's sudden attention. Every time I mentioned Supreme Court cases or constitutional precedents, someone changed the subject or told me to find real legal work. But Jordan, Dad said, his voice breaking, we didn't understand that public defense could be this significant. You never explained that you were doing real federal legal work. I explained it constantly, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. You decided it wasn't important because it didn't generate fees like Elena's corporate practice. The truth settled over the table like expensive champagne, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Attorney General Williams placed nomination documents on the table. Jordan, if you're ready, I'd like to make the official announcement to our colleagues here tonight. Before I could respond, she'd moved toward the podium that had been set up for federal legal presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, Attorney General Williams said, her voice commanding the attention of the federal legal community's most distinguished leaders, I have the honor of announcing this administration's most significant judicial nomination. The dining room fell silent as federal legal leaders turned toward the Attorney General's announcement. Jordan Martinez has established constitutional precedents that strengthen criminal procedure and protect individual rights, the kind of legal excellence that exemplifies federal judicial service. The applause was immediate and sustained. Federal judges, constitutional lawyers, and Department of Justice officials rose to their feet in recognition of work that would influence federal law for generations. As the recognition continued, I looked toward my family's table. Mom and Dad sat frozen in their seats, their assumptions about my career completely shattered. Elena managed a weak smile, but her eyes showed shock at discovering that her idealistic sibling was being honored by people she'd never imagined could exist. The celebration of Elena's corporate partnership had become the announcement of my federal judicial nomination. The aftermath. The 72 hours following Attorney General Williams's announcement transformed my family relationships and my understanding of legal recognition in ways that seemed impossible just days earlier. By Monday morning, legal publications had featured my nomination, law schools had requested speaking engagements, and federal court clerks nationwide had inquired about judicial clerkship opportunities. Elena called first, her voice mixing genuine pride with obvious bewilderment. Jordan, I had no idea your public defender work was this prestigious. Why didn't you ever explain that you were establishing actual constitutional precedents? I tried to explain it constantly, I replied. Every time I mentioned Supreme Court cases or federal appeals, someone told me to find real legal work that paid better. But we thought you were just handling routine criminal cases, not constitutional law that could influence federal judicial practice. Federal criminal defense is constitutional law. It always was. The conversation marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how Elena viewed legal career achievement and public service. Mom called next, her voice heavy with regret and confusion. Jordan, I feel terrible about how we've been treating your work. We just didn't understand that public defense could be this significant to the legal system. You didn't want to understand, I said gently. Every time I tried to share my court victories, you changed the subject to Elena's billable hours. We thought we were encouraging you toward more profitable employment. We didn't realize you were already doing the most important legal work imaginable. Dad's conversation was the most difficult, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose fundamental assumptions had collapsed. Jordan, I owe you an enormous apology. I spent years telling you to abandon public service for real legal work, while you were developing constitutional precedents that could protect my rights someday. You weren't trying to hurt me, I said. You just couldn't imagine that public defense could be more important than corporate practice. How do I make up for 3 years of dismissing the most important legal work you'll ever do? By supporting what I'm actually accomplishing instead of what you think I should be accomplishing. The federal legal community's response was overwhelming. Within a week, I'd received support letters from constitutional law professors across the country, federal judicial endorsements worth more than any partnership offer, and law school teaching opportunities that would establish me as one of the field's leading constitutional experts. Attorney General Williams helped me navigate the confirmation process and judicial appointment procedures. Jordan, she said during one of our planning sessions, your family's reaction isn't unusual. Most people can't conceptualize constitutional law significance until they see the federal recognition it receives. They made me feel like my work was pointless charity for 3 years. Your work was never pointless. Their understanding was limited. There's a difference. The most significant change came in my relationship with professional confidence. For years, my family's dismissive attitudes had made me question whether public defense was valuable or sustainable as a serious legal career. Now, surrounded by federal legal leaders who understood the implications of my work, I realized that my constitutional law practice was exactly as important as I'd always believed, regardless of my family's ability to recognize its value. 6 months later, my Senate confirmation hearings had concluded with unanimous approval, and I'd been sworn in as a federal district judge. Constitutional law students worldwide studied my precedents, and federal criminal procedure had been strengthened by my Supreme Court victories. My family's understanding of my career had evolved dramatically. Elena regularly brought colleagues to my judicial swearing-in ceremonies, proudly introducing me as my sibling, the federal judge. Mom and Dad had become enthusiastic advocates for public defense funding and constitutional protection. But the most important transformation was internal. I'd learned that legal worth isn't determined by family recognition, and constitutional significance doesn't require unanimous approval from people who lack expertise in federal law. During a recent family dinner, Dad offered career advice about managing my judicial responsibilities. Jordan should consider the precedent-setting potential of every case carefully, he suggested. Federal district court decisions can influence constitutional law for generations. I'm focused on ensuring equal justice and constitutional protection rather than building legal legacies, I replied. The quality of justice matters most. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you an exceptional federal judge, he said with genuine pride. The conversation ended without argument or defensiveness. His opinion was valuable input now, not authority that could undermine my professional confidence. Looking around the table at people who had shaped my childhood and challenged my adulthood, I felt something I'd never experienced during family dinners. Complete peace with my chosen career path and absolute confidence in my constitutional contributions. The young lawyer who had desperately wanted family approval for their public service career had evolved into a federal judge whose work was protecting constitutional rights nationwide. My family's recognition was gratifying, but it wasn't the source of my professional identity. The federal legal community's validation confirmed what I'd always known. Constitutional protection is valuable whether or not everyone understands its importance. I'd learned that some achievements transcend family approval, some careers exceed conventional understanding, and some contributions to justice matter regardless of who recognizes their significance. The public defense work that had been dismissed as wasting a law degree was now influencing federal law, protecting constitutional rights, and establishing me as a leader in criminal justice.